take this out of the way.
Okay, everyone, it's my great pleasure to introduce Alice Pinheiro Walla. She's an associate professor at McMaster University. She works on Kant's practical philosophy. She wrote many articles in this book, Happiness in Kant's Practical Philosophy. It's about happiness in Kant, not the happiness in doing Kant, in working on Kant's practical philosophy. And I do have to say that I have this tiny resentment towards Alice because before she came here, I was clearly the best Brazilian Jewish Kantian philosophy in Ontario. But now I am no longer true. But anyway, so yeah, oh yeah, and she's gonna talk about is there a right to travel?
Okay, thank you very much, Sérgio, Martina. Thank you very much for being here. You will notice that we are Brazilians because I call him in a way that probably no one does. I call him Sérgio, and then he calls me Alice, and no one does. No one balance, right? What? Who? Sérgio. That guy. So thank you very much for being here. I will need your help because this is a new research project. Actually, it's a research project that I got started a long time ago. But then I moved jobs, I moved continents, and that has been on hold for a while. And now I'm finally really getting started, and it is being funded by a shirk inside the grant. Yay, hooray for Canada! Right? So this is the topic of my talk today. It disappeared. Oh. Just a second. Now it's back. This presentation keeps me on my toes. Okay, so whether there is a right to travel, now I have to qualify that because when you see a right to travel, you usually think about tourism, right? This is not what I'll be talking about, although I'll be talking about global mobility, which is also relevant for tourism, if you want, right? And the idea that I want to explore is a central concept in Kant's cosmopolitan theory, namely the concept of hospitality. And I will try to offer an account of Kantian hospitality as a communication right. So this is the idea. Okay. So first of all, let's think about hospitality and this mobility right, which I'm calling here very loosely the right to travel. Now, the idea why this topic is very exciting for us, I will anticipate, is because Kant seems to think that hospitality, understood as what Cosmopolitan Law is all about, it's about this hospitality, right, is central for promoting global peace. And you're kind of like, what? Okay, this is big stuff. Okay, so let us have a look at the proposal. So I'll start thinking about the structure of hospitality. So just think about it in your life. So we all experience hospitality. So I'm here, a guest at the Center for Ethics. So thank you. You guys are my hosts. I traveled, right? From the Königsberg of Ontario, Hamilton. I hopped into the gold bus and came here for excitement, right? Got lost at Union Station. You know, asked for the metro, and the people didn't understand. They were asking about subways. Subway. Okay, found my way here. So I'm enjoying your hospitality, right? And it's interesting that what I'm doing here is, of course, an exchange of academic, intellectual ideas. So I am exchanging my research with you guys, and we'll be hearing your thoughts as well. Now, but let's think about hospitality more broadly. So hospitality is a very venerable and ancient practice. So you find hospitality in several cultures, religions, right? So it's something considered at times very holy. And the structure is that you have a host and a guest, right? So who are these guys? So the guest is someone who is invited into your environment, but this is someone who does not ordinarily belong to that environment. So you have the idea of an outsider being invited into the host's space. Now, you also have the idea of entertaining the guest, providing for the guest's needs. So I have been fed a nice piece of vegetarian pizza here, right? And also interaction, conversation, and so on. Now, you may have had this experience also in your homes with family and friends, so degrees of familiarity, but we can also think about hospitality as a radical practice. Think about the practice of welcoming complete strangers. And this goes back to the cultural religious traditions that I mentioned earlier. So there are practices of welcoming travelers, right? So giving them a place to sleep or just simply giving them a meal, right? And as a practice, this is very radical. Why? Because hospitality is generosity and an openness to that stranger. So an openness to the stranger. And of course, this generosity opens up a very deep vulnerability. So now we need to look at the guest because it's a two-way relational structure, meaning that the host has a certain duty towards the guest, but given the vulnerability that we have in this relationship, right, we also conceive the guest as having duties. So you have people having to adapt to the rules of your environment, right? So I had to wait outside for the class of Martina to finish. I was already, full of eagerness, trying to bump into the class and get set for my presentation. And Sergio was like, no, hold on. I saw pizza, and I was like, right? So there are rules that the guest has to abide by, although there may be some exceptions that it may be reasonable for the host to take into account to accommodate the guest. So if I was invited to your home, let's suppose I smoke, I don't smoke, but pulling out a cigarette in a non-smoker home, that would be probably a violation of hospitality as a guest. However, if I have certain dietary requirements, right? Perhaps it's not unreasonable to expect that my host should take some note of that dietary requirement, depending on the nature of the dietary requirement, right? So there implicit rules for interaction between hosts and guests. Now, we are talking about this interpersonal relation, hospitality, right? Now think about hospitality as in our context here, as moved into an international context. What does it mean to think about hospitality internationally? Well, first of all, you may think about it as a service, right? So when I was doing my research, it was very annoying because I was Googling hospitality and then get all these ads for hotels, right? And resorts and whatnot. So there is a service, right? And this is the innkeeper traditionally. That service provider who welcomed and offered accommodation for travelers. And of course, already there were fiduciary duties, certain duties of the innkeepers towards the guests and so on. But this is not what Kant has in mind. And in fact, he was not the first to think about hospitality in this international domain, right? So the tradition goes back to natural law theorists, so talking about hospitality. So you think Francisco de Vitoria, so he thought about hospitality as, of course, within the framework of the Europeans traveling and discovering, right, lands in the Americas. And they were trying to figure out a framework for these international relations. Of course, the criticism has been that these theories of hospitality were used to justify colonialism, right? However, I want to take what is interesting out of this notion, namely that there is something like an international framework for relations between foreigners and host countries, right? But more fundamentally, a very interesting idea of a global community. So now people say global community, but actually what are the normative foundations for this idea? And we see that these thinkers, right, back in the 17th century, and Kant were thinking about a global community. Right? So if you think about the history of philosophy, the idea of global community goes back to the Stoics. So there was this idea of the, right, community of all humans, Cosmopolitas, right? So this polity, right, the polis, right, thought as the whole world. So the polis was like very centralized as a ancient Greek political or association, right? And suddenly you think of the whole world as one unified polity, right? This is the Stoics. Now we need to have a look at these modern guys and Kant, how they are conceiving that community of the earth. So this is the concept, right? It's that global community, a community of the earth. And I'll be talking in more detail about it. Now, there is, of course, a deep relationship between hospitality and mobility. So if you remember before, if someone goes and visits you, right? There is the idea of someone from outside moving towards you, entering your space. So as we will see, and this is the key for understanding why these guys think hospitality and community of the earth together. There is something about global mobility, right? Moving around the world, meeting different people, right? That necessitates this framework. So it's central, this idea for the framework. So we're also looking about this in more detail. And of course, mobility enables communication, right? So what are we doing when we move around the world? So if you're just a tourist and you go into the touristy industry, right? Perhaps you will not communicate much with locals. but the idea is that there is something you learn. There is someone different you meet, right? And it's interesting about Kant that he lived in a Hafenstadt. So Hafenstadt is it's a Hafen. It's where the ships come. Port. It's a port city, right? So Königsberg was very cosmopolitan. So you imagine Kant, this intelligent, right? Highly attuned individual to the developments of the world. Of course, he would not go anywhere. He would get the guys come to him and he would hear the accounts, right? So you have, and there's even a passage in the anthropology where he talks about, praises Königsberg as being this kind of cosmopolitan place. Why do you need anything else, right? Should I ask for anything more? Dun, dun, dun. I've got foreigners, I've got university, I've got my books. Should I ask for something more? No, right? It's perfect. So Kant himself experienced this kind of structure of being able to exchange ideas and getting the reports from the travelers, right? Now, it's interesting what he does with the idea of travel, mobility, and hospitality. Now, think about it. Although there is this venerable tradition of hospitality, so you see that in Judaism very, very strongly. So Abraham, for instance, had the tent open into 4 directions. And the idea was he was ready to welcome anyone coming from any corner of the earth, assuming that the earth had 4 corners, right? So any corner. It's always open, right? This hospitality. And when I was in Brazil now, I met with colleagues who work on scholastics. And they were telling me that in several monasteries, they have spaces just for accommodating travelers or pilgrims or so on, right? However, travel also had a bad reputation. Travelers had a bad reputation. Why? So the idea was that if you left your society, if you left the social pressure of your community, you go wild, right? As illustrated by, European behavior that Kant describes, right, in the lands of other peoples. So you are out of that control, right? You go rogue, right? So people used to think, okay, this is a traveler, this is someone who is not necessarily under the social control of their communities. They will do whatever they want, right? And Kant is aware of that. So coming from the experience of colonialism, but also it's interesting that he mentions other peoples as violating hospitality. Right? So he mentions the Bedouins attacking nomad tribes in the desert and enslaving them. Right? So he mentions pirates attacking ships and taking people prisoners, right? So he was aware of violations of hospitality. So whenever locals and travelers come into contact, that there's vulnerability of the host, right? But also of the guest. Right? So he wants to take this into account, and we will see how. But in a sense, I think that he rehabilitates the idea of global mobility. So he says something, even though there is the possibility of abuse, we must not give up the cosmopolitan vision, right? So he praises, for instance, Japan and China, the way these two nations dealt with the Europeans. So kind of like had to do with them once, and kind of like, I know you guys. So give them access, but no entry. So like you stay at the door, we'll deal with you guys later, right? So he thought it was okay. Thought they were justified because they knew of their inhospitable behavior as guests. So it's not an unconditional duty, right? Just to take in whoever does not also give you at least some guarantee or reason to believe that you will behave and not threaten the local community, and the other way around, right? Okay, so let me see what I have now. So here's the purpose of this research project, and I need you guys to help me when we discuss the topic. So I want to research what would be the normative foundations of global mobility. I have here right to travel, right? But just the idea to move around the world, of course, we have a world that is divided into sovereign territorial states. So this, of course, complicates the matter, borders, right? However, there's still a lot of public ways of getting from one place to the other, or at least to try to seek interaction with other groups, right? So what is the foundation, right? What is the argument for that? And I will be focusing on Kant's legal conception of cosmopolitanism. So I'll tell you a little bit about these different cosmopolitanisms. I'm fascinated about the fact that it's actually a legal conception, genuinely based on something that can be called a right. So I'm very wary to use the concept of a right where I think we cannot speak about a right. We can think perhaps about a duty of virtue, right? But a right is something that in principle you should be able to claim as something that belongs to you, right? It's not something we should use loosely, I think. And I will try to explore this mobility as a communicative right. So there are proposals out there, for instance, stressing primarily a right to trade. So the right to visit in Kant would be a right to trade. I would like to think it as a communication right, which is important for us as academics. Because if you think about it, depending on the discipline, of course, but thinking as Kantians, right? Kant scholarship is very international. We work in different languages, right? You see several countries coming together. So now with the Kant year, right? The 300 years of Kant's anniversary, you see several parts of the Kantian world getting together. So this right to communicate, this right to seek an interaction, right, without being treated as an enemy. This is the fundamental idea of cosmopolitanism, that the one who's seeking to exchange with you, right, is prima facie not an enemy, right? Should not be treated as an enemy, right? So this is very important for academia, for what we do, right? But also for other areas. For instance, I have a colleague, Claudia Emerson, and she works in global health. And when I got my position at McMaster, she was very excited when she learned about this, because she said, if we're working on vaccines and pandemics and whatnot, we need to be able to coordinate and get together. So actually, mobility and communication for the possibility of these very pressing kinds of research is crucial. And she was reporting the problems with, getting visas for certain people and so on, because mobility is being treated primarily as immigration control, right? I'm saying this very bluntly. So people think about someone who travels as a potential immigrant. And this is one of the reasons why I would like to focus on global mobility as a right of communication, right? Because if we reduce global mobility, right, and if we understand mobility checks and controls just as a tool for preventing immigration of certain groups, there are a lot of other things that we will be losing, right? Academically, intellectually, and perhaps even in the way of getting to know each other better and perhaps working out solutions for peace, which is what Kant seems to have had in mind, okay? Let's have a look at hospitality as a norm of international law. Now, cosmopolitanism. So as I said before, so you find the idea of hospitality in Kant's theory of cosmopolitan law. So you have the doctrine of right. So this is this book here. This is the German. So you have three kinds of public law. You have state law, you have international law, which is the law of nations, traditionally called, right? And you have that stuff, cosmopolitanism, which is kind of like a little bit of an innovation, right? Okay. So what is attractive about cosmopolitanism? So especially in times of divisiveness, right? Polarization, you have this very hopeful idea that people actually constitute a community, that there is a shared set of duties and rights. So something we have in common, right? Merely as people who are in the earth. Now, there are other types of cosmopolitanism as well. So let me just run you over that. So you have epistemic cosmopolitanism. And this is the idea, Kantian idea, by the way, that cosmopolitanism enables us to leave our very private point of view, right? The Greek idiotes is like the private person. The idiot is actually a private person, a person who has no access to the common, right? So you are able to get to know another perspective, to put yourself and try to understand the perspective of someone who is different from you, who thinks differently from you, and thereby you are able to amplify your horizons. You may not, you do not have to take over the perspective of the other, but the dialogue enables you to see things from a larger perspective, right? So this is epistemic cosmopolitanism. Moral cosmopolitanism is the idea of humanity. So this is usually, I think that commentators tend to mix a little bit legal cosmopolitanism with this moral cosmopolitanism. So there is a human community. We should have certain duties to others by virtue of our shared humanity. It's interesting that, of course, legal cosmopolitanism does not deny moral cosmopolitanism, but it's not the feature that is at the forefront. So I'll tell you more about it in a minute. Cultural cosmopolitanism is perhaps what most people have in mind when they talk about cosmopolitanism. So if I say, oh, Martina is very cosmopolitan, right? So what do I mean thereby? I mean that Martina is at home in different cultures. Perhaps she has lived in different countries. She speaks different languages. I know this is the case, right? So she's very cosmopolitan. So this is really trying to get to know and become acquainted with different cultures, or like appropriate or getting to know a little bit these different cultures. Now, what is legal cosmopolitanism? There is no world state. So how can we talk about legal cosmopolitanism? So I will have to tell you a little more about the normative basis of cosmopolitan law, which is this concept of community of the earth, right? So Kant's legal cosmopolitanism, just for the formulation, and I will explain that in more detail. Kant says it's very minimal, right? It's restricted to the conditions of general hospitality. So we see hospitality again. So cosmopolitanism, at its bare minimum, it's that, hospitality, right? Okay, but what is the basis? Kant's community of the earth. Interesting. Where do you see this concept for the first time? So it is mentioned in Cosmopolitan Law, but actually you hear about it the first time in the Doctrine of Right, in Kant's theory of property. And I think it has been underanalyzed. Now people are catching up in Kant scholarship, but still very misunderstood, because I think there is a tendency, I might be wrong about this, but I feel an unwillingness and perhaps an embarrassment of Kant scholars to talk about property rights, because it seems like right-wing, libertarian. We don't like that. I kind of like, come on, put these concerns aside and have a look at the theory, okay? It might not be what you think it is, right? So yeah, so what was this concept before Kant? It's not his invention. So natural law theorists were thinking about community of the earth. And what was the idea? This is why people don't like that, right? Oh, community of the earth was usually the concept you use to justify acquisition of resources, okay? So in the natural law story, and you see that in Grotius, you see that in Pufendorf, you see that in Locke, you see that idea very often. Why are we allowed to have the stuff we have, the territory that we have, right, and so on? Oh, it's because God gave us the earth in common. Right? So how do you know that you're allowed to use these resources, right? After all, think about it. The apple you eat is the apple that everybody else is deprived of. Don't think about that too much, otherwise you'll be freaked out, right? So you know the apple I'm eating, right? Make you guilty forever, right? But why are you allowed to do that? So the idea of the community of the earth was that, okay, because the earth was somehow given to us in common as a bounty, naturally we go around making use of these resources. Why? Because the boss made you, the boss made the stuff, and you're supposed to survive, right? Very, very intuitive. So the boss told you, go for it. Yay, okay, we are allowed, right? The problem then is when the earth has been acquired by everybody, and then you have something like inequality. Now that needs justification. But the idea of the community of the earth was supposed to explain this initial community, like everything in common, right? And then the division, why you were allowed to go for it and take resources while other people are being deprived. Locke would say, oh, there was enough and as much for everybody else, you know. Drink your glass of water, you're not drinking the whole river. Come on, stop being crazy, right? At some stage, you come to have problems with that. Okay, so one of the reasons Kant scholars don't like this idea is because they think Kant is doing the same thing. Kant is just you know, justifying appropriation of resources, private property, perhaps something like bourgeois property or something like that, right? So just justifying the status quo. Now, Kant does several things differently, right? And it's interesting to see how Kant Kantianizes the history of philosophy. When he does stuff that other philosophers do, it is Kantianized. It's like, it's not what you think it is, it's actually Kant. I don't know how he manages that, but it's always the case. right? So what is new about his cosmopolitanism? What is new about this community of the earth, right? Now, first of all, I was telling you that there are several levels of public law. Cosmopolitan law is considered public law. So you have the rights of states, so municipal law, whatever we have within the society. Then you have the law of nations, international law, states in their relations with each other. And then you have this weird stuff on the top. And you could ask, why can't you collapse cosmopolitan law into international law? Because think about the passport regime, right? So if it's about global mobility and rules of hospitality, well, this is something that states can do, right? Bilaterally with each other, agreements, whether you need a visa, depending on your passport. This is what we have today, right? But no, he thought that this is something that was needed to supplement international law and domestic law. So we need to have a look why this is the case. Now, the community of the earth becomes secularized in Kant's account. Now, I need to qualify that because a lot of people think, the difference between Kant and the natural law theories is just that he, got God out of the picture and became secular and became compatible with critical theory, because otherwise you would make theological assumptions and so on. It's a bit more complicated than that. So he does give a different account of the community of the earth, but more importantly, it becomes formal. Kant being Kant, you cannot introduce substantive considerations. Needs, for instance, okay? And this is what shocks people. Needs cannot be the source of rights. What? What am I doing here? Let's leave, okay? But there is a reason for that, right? It's because a right has to have a certain structure of reciprocity. So you need to base rights on something deeper and more universal than needs. Needs vary, right? Although you can argue, okay, there may be some objective, universal human needs that we could agree on. But I hope I will be telling you a little bit more about the structure of rights in Kant's theory. But the idea is that a legal right, is based on a structural relation, a formal relation that has the structure of reciprocity. So if I have a right and you have a duty, we must be in a relation in regard to each other that is actually fundamentally reciprocous. This is how you get rights off the ground, so, right? So it's always between persons, animal rights, you can talk about it, it's difficult, complicated, but you're thinking primarily about relations between persons. You can talk about other rights too, but you need to do a little bit more of a stretch for that from a Kantian perspective. Okay. These, of course, will have implications for Kant's conception of hospitality, right? Now, what I will do now, guys, I will just go over a passage with you, and I'll read the passage slowly. Right? So this is from the Doctrine of Right. This is the section on Cosmopolitan Law. You probably read it, right? Together. I'll read with you guys, and I will interpret it as we go. So as we will see, so of course, there are two places where you look for cosmopolitan rights and for hospitality. So this is primarily, right, towards perpetual peace, right? And the Doctrine of Right. The Doctrine of Right came later. So usually people appeal to towards perpetual peace, 1795. There is some discussion in the scholarship whether Kant changed his position in the later Doctrine of Right. So I tend to focus on the Doctrine of Right. I think that the position is consistent between the two texts. But we can discuss this in more detail. So let's go over the passage, and I'll just reconstruct the concepts I'll be talking about in more detail. So hopefully it will be helpful. So cosmopolitan law, right? Cosmopolitan right. This rational idea of a peaceful, even if not friendly, thoroughgoing community of all nations on the earth, this is my emphasis, that can come into relations affecting one another, is not a philanthropic, it's not an ethical principle, but a principle having to do with rights. Okay, so it's a legal relation, even though non-positive, right? Okay, so let's have a look. Interesting, peaceful but not friendly. Now, if you think about private hospitality, you would perhaps think about friendly, right? So you see that it's getting a bit more impersonal here, right? Peaceful, even if not friendly. Now, community of all nations. So this has led some kind of scholars to think, oh, this is a change. Because in perpetual peace, Kant is thinking about the relations of individuals and foreign countries. And here, he's thinking about cosmopolitan right as between nations. Nations. Okay, he changed. No, he does mention individuals down the line. I think that we have both positions. So a community of the nations, but also the possibility of, isolated individuals moving around the world, entering, right, contact with these foreign communities. So they can come into relations affecting each other. So there is an impact there, right? And this is not a matter of the goodness of your heart. You're like, oh, I'm so goody, I'm going to be nice to the traveler. No, there is something that the foreigner can really claim, although, of course, there might not be a cosmopolitan institution for you to go and claim your rights, but it is based on a right, right? Okay. Nature, now here comes the interesting. Nature has enclosed them, all these folks and these nations, together within by the spherical shape of the place they live in, a globus terráqueo. So you see between Abraham and Kantian, you already have, no longer four corners, you already have the idea of the hospitality has changed a little bit, okay? So we have the idea of a globus terráqueo. Okay. And since possession of the land on which an inhabitant of the earth can live, this is weird, can be thought only as possession of a part of a determinate whole, and so as a possession of that to which each of them originally has a right. What? It follows that all nations stand originally in a community of land. Now, if you understand nothing about this passage, just the ending, it follows. So you figure out he's trying to provide a justification or an account of this original community of land. Okay, let's try to figure out how it works. Nature has enclosed us together within determinate limits. Now, it's interesting that this is, first of all, not the idea of anything voluntary. Right? Because in a community, you kind of like you reach out, let's hold hands. Community of the earth, guys. No, we have the idea here of being stuck with each other within an earth that is bounded, right? It has limits. You cannot scatter indefinitely. You're a bit stuck with each other, right? Okay. Now, possession of the earth on which you can live can only be thought as a possession of a part within a bounded whole. What does it mean? Now I have to explain something to you now. So this is the idea that perhaps is not really well appreciated nowadays. When can you have a right against someone? Right? Think about legal systems. You have a right against someone if your right is somehow a provision of that legal system. But more fundamentally, you are in a legal community in regard that person you hold your right against, correct? Now, he's trying to do this in a natural law context, right? We don't have a common state, right? However, if I'm going to have a piece of land, I acquire that land, right? And I have a right against everybody else, right? That my acquisition be respected. Meaning, when you come to me, my rules, I'm gonna let you in, I look, okay, you come in. No, I don't like you, I don't know you, no. They're kind of like, why do you have that authority over that piece of land, right? You are imposing a duty on me. You are acting as if you have a right. How come do you have that authority on me? The explanation is because my possession is the part of a whole. Terrible, right? We share the earth with each other, but the point is we are already in a legal relation in regards to each other. So the community of the earth is establishing a legal community that is presupposed ex ante for the talk of acquisition, of acquired rights. I cannot have a right against someone I am not already in a legal relation. That is the idea. Now, you don't have a state. You don't have a common legal order. So the theoretical trick, if you want, the strategy is to create that community, right? And the community is established somehow via the fact that the planet is bounded and we are stuck with each other. So you see, Locke would have said, the boss gave us the earth in common. So you would have a communism, right? Not from Kant. So here we have this idea of space, of shared space, and the possibility of interaction. So Arthur is big on these ideas. Arthur wrote a lot about this, right? Okay. So the community of land is that community of the earth that is established by the fact that we share this space. Okay. Questions? Soon. Okay. It follows that all nations stand originally in a community of land, though, and here's the difference from the predecessors, not of rightful community of possession, and so of use of it, or of property in it. Instead, they stand in a community of possible physical interaction. So Wechselwirkung is the original German, and then he gives the Latin, commercio, which is like, could be trade, but it could also be just interacting with people, right? That is a thoroughgoing relation of each to all the others, of offering to engage in commerce with any other. Verkehr. Verkehr is also transit. So it's interesting that the idea of interaction, right, is also the idea of movement, of transit, getting around, right? And each has a right to make this attempt without the other being authorized to behave towards it as an enemy, because he has made this attempt. So this attempt to communication, to interaction, is not a declaration of war. Hey, wait a bit, right? No. Okay, so let's have a look at it in more detail. So the first claim here, we have a community of land, but we should not understand it as a communism of resources, right? So, okay, I'm oversimplifying the natural law tradition, the guys who talked about community of the earth, but it's also a very intuitive idea if you don't think about it, if you think about it uncritically, right? You see that in Rousseau. The assumption seems to be that the starting point of humanity exploiting resources is a communism. Communism is the default position. And in Rousseau, you see that appropriation, right, is theft. So he acknowledges that there could be first acquisition, like innocent first acquisition, but usually what we have in terms of division, right, of land and of resources, is the might of the powerful. So at some stage, there was some, innocent acquisition here and there, and then a stronger king or group arrived, dispossessed the original possessions, and what you have is what people can establish and keep by might, right? So everything, in a sense, is theft. And the social contract in Rousseau comes to fix. So only, this community where people are forced to be free and so on can kind of like give acquisition the moral character it needs to be compatible with the freedom of the members of society, something like that. It's theft, communism and theft. This is not the idea that we have here. So we have a community, but not a community of stuff. So how is that a community of the earth? So we are together in the earth. We can impact each other, right? Elsewhere, when Kant discusses this very concept, community of the earth, in his theory of acquisition, right? He talks about the idea of occupation of space. So embodied beings have to be somewhere. Now imagine each of us popping out in the world as we are born, right? So imagine I was born far away, closer to us. Sergio was born, but I assume you were already gone by the time. No. No, were you São Paulo? 78? Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we're close. Okay. So if you imagine all these possible locations, right? You can unite them, right? So we are all united. And as climate change makes clear, right? Whatever happens in one part of the world can vary the other part. So we see Kant acknowledging very early on, right? The fact that our external actions can impact each other globally. So we have a global issue here, the possibility of interaction and impact on each other, right? Okay, so this community is understood very thinly, very just in a formal manner, right? Did I put I did. 1 minute, okay. And from this, it follows that you are allowed to seek interaction. But why? So we are a community of the earth, and it means that we are allowed to seek interactions with others. Why? Does it follow? We can talk about this in a minute. So this right, since it has to do with the possible union of all nations with a view to certain universal laws for the possible commerce, can be called cosmopolitan right. So in Perpetual Peace, he mentions something like, bear in mind that we are all divided here, everybody has their space, but in principle, no one had more right to any other area of the earth. Is this the argument? What does it mean? So it's like, you're there, but don't be too rude to other people, because the fact that you're there is contingent. So you have a right. Your right is not being contested to your territory and your right to control as a host. However, this is not an absolute right, because we share the earth. Everybody has to be somewhere. Now, the jump from this idea, okay, everybody has to be somewhere, you are allowed to control your territory, to that idea that we are all allowed to be able to go somewhere else to offer ourselves for interaction, right? That is still not clear. But the idea is that this seeking for communication has a function, even if we do not have that as our motivation. So what you have is when people regularly seek interaction, commerce, exchange, right? You have students and so on. There are bilateral agreements. There is legal stuff being put in place to regulate these kinds of communications. The more communication, the more legal apparatus is created, uniting those nations, right? Why is that not only international law? I think because that idea of hospitality, that attitude, right, that is based on a right, cannot perhaps be coerced. I'm not quite sure. I don't have an answer for this. This is something that I'm trying to think about. Okay, so I'll just finish now, so we go on time. So the passage finishes with some reflections about teleology. So it's a bit old-fashioned stuff, but back in the days, people would argue, oh, we are not meant to get together because different languages, okay? Think about Tower of Babel, right? Get these guys apart by making them speak different languages. So we speak different languages, different cultures. Perhaps we'd better keep away from each other. And then we have seas, we have the oceans, we have deserts, keeping these groups apart. What are you doing? Sending, people to communicate with the others, creating trouble and so on. And what I think Kant is saying is that, well, you could think about those places you cannot really acquire to live as keeping open the possibility of travel, of communication. So if you think about the oceans, you can't really live in the ocean. Desert, it's a bit difficult, right? So you have these possibilities of getting from one place to the other. Of course, now we have air travel, but it belongs, of course, over the territory of someone. But you have this idea that it is possible to travel through public alleyways. And we can see this as separating us, but you could also see that as inviting us to get together, right? So teleology can go both ways. It doesn't really. And then the very nice message at the end that despite being aware of the abuses of colonialism, of people enslaving each other, that it's worth upholding, right? Cosmopolitan right as a right to visit all the rages and establish this communication. Okay, I'll stop here, guys. It's good enough. Let's do a discussion. Good. Thank you very much.